have the vessel headed into this strait. In vain, Captain Brent remonstrated and declared that we must be lost if we encountered an ice pack or were overtaken by a storm in this narrow place. The wind is fair, said he, but if we encountered an ice pack blocking the passage, as we most likely shall, we can never navigate the ship out again without more sea room. It was the first serious disagreement we had ever had since we started on the voyage, and I could not but feel that as a navigator, with the responsibilities for the safety of the vessel and the lives of the crew, he was right. I begged him to lay in as close as he could to the mouth of the strait, that we might examine it more closely, and on this we compromised and put the vessel's head in towards the opening, intending to heave to and claw off the shore, as the wind was light and the sea comparatively calm. And here it did seem that Providence was furthering my apparent wild purpose, for when he had dropped the ship into within a few 100 feet of the opening, and ordered the helm down to bring her about, the wind suddenly flailed that there was not a steerage way enough to bring the vessel's head round, and we drifted helplessly at the mercy of the waves. Instantly all was commotion, for a ship on shore without a wind is a perilous condition, as a steamer with a broken wheel. The bow anchor was quickly cleared and the lead cast, but there was no bottom, and so to cast anchor would be useless. The current had now caught us, and there was nothing for it but to head straight into the opening, or be broken into pieces on the icy promontories that stood out like Scylla and Charybdis on either hand. My heart bounded as we passed between the towering ice walls, and I felt a thrill of excitement such as Columbus must have experienced when the long-looked-for Antilles lifted on his expectant vision. The apprehensions of Captain Brent proved groundless. The passage was open, and though there was considerable floating ice, the current was driving it in the same direction, and we experienced no difficulty in sailing through. Indeed, it was impossible for us to do anything but go through, for after we had gotten fairly into the strait, the current was like a mighty, swift flowing river, and had there been a fair wind to go back, it must have blown half a gale to drive us against such a tide as was sweeping through. I was convinced that this was a permanent strait, and not merely an accidental break in the great barriers. The regular smoothness of the sides showed the effects of a continuous current and the abrasions of great masses of ice carried through by it. I say I was convinced then, but when, on our return, we found the passage in every respect practically in the same condition as when we passed through first, there was positively no room for doubt. I will not contend that this strait is always open, but I do maintain that it is a permanent channel through which strong current flows, and I'm certain that there is a backbone of terra firma underneath these barriers of ice, through which this passage cuts, and is as permanent and clearly defined as the Straits of Magellan or Gibraltar. I have a theory, but it must be elucidated in dry deductions of scientific reasoning. I will not inject it into this narrative. It is my intention, though, as soon as possible, to prepare a more elaborate work, which I am constrained to believe will be a valuable addition to scientific literature. It is probable that this passage is sometimes closed by ice packs, or the entrance may be jammed with great masses of drift ice, while beyond the channel may still be open. With the current always flowing through from the north, it's easy to imagine that a great iceberg, happening to be nearby, would be drawn in. If it were large enough to fill up the passage, as many of them are, it would be firmly held there until crushed and broken up by the waves, hiding the strait and giving the appearance of a solid ice wall. Then, too, mariners in these wild sea wastes are very cautious, seldom approaching near enough to the barriers to detect this passage, even if it were open. What the depth of it is, we had no means of ascertaining, for though we spliced together all the lead lines aboard the ship, we never succeeded in finding the bottom anywhere. On account of the tremendous current that set through with the ship, the log was valueless, but from close observation, both going and coming, Captain Brent estimates the length of the passage to be about 25 miles. On the further side of the ice walls and sea presented practically the same features as on this, the shining cliffs running away as far as the eye could see on either hand, while the black ocean heaved with great billows that broke with the continuous thunder against the barriers, or threw their spray high up on the great solemn icebergs that floated in silent majesty, too immense to be shaken by Neptune in the wildest efforts of his wrath. The sun, which had been rising but a little way above the horizon for some time past, disappeared entirely soon after we got into the open sea beyond the barriers, but when the air was not filled with sleet or snow, it was never really dark. The aurora australis, too, frequently lighted the sea with its weird, strange glow, so that it was easy for us to keep up the frozen coastline in view. My object was now to circumnavigate this polar sea, sailing eastward along the south side of the barriers until we came again in view of Mount Erebus, far off to the northwest. We then headed the ship due south, and soon sunk the ice-bound coast and mountain beneath the black horizon of the Antarctic Sea. My idea then was that we were in an open polar sea, ice-locked all around, and we thought to sail directly across until we reached the barriers on the opposite side, and thus obtain a knowledge of its extent. Shortly after we crossed the ice barriers, the needle became erratic, deflecting more and more every day until it entirely reversed itself. The weather was fair, and we detected this by the constellations, or we would undoubtedly have sailed out of our course and turned the ship around in following the compass. For weeks after we passed through Barrington Strait, as I've been egotistical enough to christen it, we had storms, snow, and ice, and the black ocean through which we plowed was in no wise different from that which extends from Cape Horn to Victoria Land, except that we noticed less ice and met with no storms as severe as we encountered on this side, both going and coming. I will not weary the reader with details of our long voyage in this hitherto unknown ocean. In the course of time, the sun again appeared as we drew southward, and the sea became cleared of ice, and the cold moderated, as it does in traveling from the poles to the equator. In vain we looked for the ice barriers which we supposed surrounded us. Only the black open sea stretched on, and we held our course. There were no exciting incidents, and 4 months after passing the barriers we were sailing in open seas out in the region of ice and snow, with the weather constantly growing warmer. 2 months later we encountered driftwood, and not long afterwards seafowls appeared and grew more numerous every day. They first appeared on the starboard side, as their number increased from day to day, including some that were unmistakably land birds. I expressed the opinion to Captain Brent that we were sailing parallel to some coast, and suggested that the ship's course be altered to make this shore. This was done, and evidence of land, such as seaweed and driftwood, became more apparent every day. My interest and excitement became so great that I could not be still a moment when awake, and could sleep but a little. In a fever of restlessness I walked the deck hour after hour, and scanned the horizon for land, a perfectly useless waste of energy, as a man was stationed in the lookout, who, of course, would see the land long before it became visible from the deck. The weather was fine, and we were evidently nearing land of some kind. As night closed on the 20th of July, an illumination of some kind was plainly visible on the horizon off the starboard bow, and the vessel's head was turned towards it. My excitement was so great that I did not go down to my cabin for supper. The illumination grew plainer constantly, and at 10 o'clock the lookout at the mast had said he could distinguish what seemed to be electric lights. At this my hopes fell. I had been thrilled with the idea of approaching an unknown land in an unknown ocean, and now it seemed that in some way we had gotten back into the beaten track of the world and was approaching a modern city. Captain Brent was of the opinion that it was one of the cities on the west coast of South America, although it was impossible to understand how we could have gotten there, as we had been sailing north by the heavens ever since we left the polar regions. In short time it was plainly to be seen from the deck that we were approaching a considerable city lighted by electricity. As we neared the land, the lead was heaved constantly, and after running in as close as he dared, the captain cast anchor and waited for daylight before attempting to enter the harbor. As soon as the ship was made snug and everything became quiet on board, I was struck by the strange silence of the city that lay before us. Although evidently a large city and a modern one, if we might judge from the brilliant manner in which it was lighted, there was an entire absence of that roar and rumble which characterizes the modern American or European city. As a matter of fact, although we lay within a few miles, no sound of any kind came to us, and the silence was strange and weird, like as though it was some brilliantly illuminated city of the dead. I was awakened next morning by the creaking of the winch and the rattling of the cable as the anchor was hoisted, and dressing hurriedly, I went on to the deck where the captain and crew were discussing the small craft that was coming out of the harbor. Even as we looked, a most remarkable boat came tearing out and pitching towards us at the rate of at least 50 miles an hour. As it came towards us, we could see only a great billow of foam, and above it a covered deck, something like a ferry boat or excursion barge. When it came alongside of us, we could see that the vessel, if such a thing may be called a vessel, consisted of a long cigar-shaped hull submerged after the fashion of the American whaleback, with the superstructure raised on stanchions. On each end of this cylindrical hull were great cone-shaped screws somewhat larger than the hull itself, and it was these that raised the billows of foam as they leaped through the water, pushing and dragging the strange-looking boat. A uniformed pilot was put aboard, and a touching tower hawser thrown to the men in the bow, saluting and speaking perfect English, though with a peculiar accent. The pilot asked what vessel it was, on being informed that it was the Wanderer of New York, United States of America. He dropped his jaw, stretched his eyes, and looked altogether as upset as if he had been told it was the Flying Dutchman. "What land is this?" asked Captain Brent in turn. "The Iron Republic, sir," replied the pilot, again saluting and advancing to the wheel. In response to our further questioning, he courteously stated that he was an officer on duty, that it was against the rules for him to hold any conversation except in reference to the ship, and begged us to curb our curiosity until we got ashore, when all of the information we desired would be afforded us. There was nothing else for us to do, so Captain Brent turned his attention to lowering and furling the sails which had been hoisted, and by the time everything was made snug, we were alongside the pier. As soon as we were made fast, another officer came on board, and he, like the pilot, seemed to be dumbfounded when he learned that the vessel had come from the United States of America. After inspecting the ship's papers, he turned to Captain Brent and informed him that the circumstances of our arrival were so unusual and unprecedented in his experience that he would be under the necessity of conducting him to the office of the Director of Navigation. Thereupon the captain introduced me as owner and the proper person to deal with, and the officer politely requested me to accompany him. "Sir," I said, as we passed through the curious throng that had gathered on wharf. "Will you be kind enough to tell me what country this is, and what part of the world it lies?" "This," he replied, "is the Iron Republic, and the continent on which you stand lies about as far from the frozen ocean as your own continent of America does in the opposite direction." Just here, having reached the outer skirts of the crowd, he made a signal, and a man approached with a horseless vehicle and, dismounting, saluted and opened the door of his carriage, forbearing to question further an officer of whose power and authority I had not the slightest idea, and whose extreme courtesy forbade impertinence. I took my place in the carriage and was whirled along wide, smooth streets through the heart of the city. I have remarked that though we lay just outside of the harbor and in sight of the city for some hours before entering, we heard none of that roar and rumble inseparable from cities of its apparent size among us. Well, the reason was now plain. In the first place, the streets were all as smooth as a tennis court, and there was nothing to make a noise. There was not a horse to be seen, and it was evident from the floor-like cleanliness of the streets that they were not intended for the use of horses or wagons. On all sides were horseless vehicles of every description, from the lightest bicycles to large covered vans, all rubber-tired, whirling to and fro swiftly and without noise. I had only time to note the things referred to, and remarked the strange and picturesque costumes of the ladies and gentlemen who were on the street, when my conductor drew up before a large, substantial stone building covering an entire block. Stepping down from the carriage, he assisted me to alight and ushered me into a large and well-lighted reception room in the front of the building. I noticed as we approached that a blue flag with a white star floated from the tower on the roof, and surmised that in some way the two officers with whom I had been brought in contact with and the building which I had just entered represented the same department of government. Conducting me to one of the comfortable seats with which the room was supplied, my companion excused himself, saying that the gentleman who met me at the boat would be with me in a few minutes, and withdrew. Scarcely had he passed through the door when the person referred to came in, having presumably ridden up after us on his own carriage. Smiling pleasantly, he expressed the hope that I would not be annoyed by the little conventionalities to which I was being subjected, saying that my arrival was so extraordinary and so out of common with all other entries made since he had been connected with the Marine, that he had no other recourse but to refer me to the head of his department. I assured him that I was under obligations for his courteous attention, that a stranger as I was, and dazed by the extraordinary circumstances in which I had found myself, I was in a condition to absolutely require guidance and direction. He desired me to consider myself under no restraint whatsoever, stating that I was being referred to the chief of the Bureau of Navigation because he was at a loss to know how to place me on the Marine Register. Opening a door, he conducted me without ceremony into the presence of a gentleman whom he introduced as Director of Navigation and Chief of the Department of the Marine. This officer, notwithstanding his evident high position, rose and, smiling cordially, bowed himself and asked us both to be seated. In a few words, the subordinate explained to his superior the circumstances of my arrival, and asked for instructions in certain matters pertaining to the registering of my vessel. These were given, and then the high official, with rare feeling and tact, arose and grasped my hand and welcomed me to the Iron Republic, saying that, though it may lack the associations which must make my native country pleasant, it possessed advantages and attractions which he believed, from what he had been able to learn, could not be found in America. I thanked him for his cordial greeting, and assured him that while some associations of my own country had been pleasant, others were very unpleasant, and upon the whole I was glad to have found my way to the Iron Republic, whatever and wherever it might be. After inquiring into the details of my voyage, in which he manifested great interest, the director remarked that the astonishment of his countrymen at my arrival would naturally be much less than mine, inasmuch as they had a very thorough knowledge of my country. It was known, he said, from the settlement of his country that the American continent existed, indeed that it was the attempt of a shipload of emigrants to get to America that led to the discovery of the continent on which the magnificent structure of government known as the Iron Republic had been reared. This was in 1698, and driven southward by fierce gales, the colonists, after many months of battling with storm and ice, found themselves cast on the inhospitable shores of a new world. For many years after the first settlement was made, it was supposed by the colonists that they were on a portion of the American continent. But with the development of the country, the increase of knowledge, and the researches of the navigators, it was found that they had been discoverers as well as colonizers. They knew all that was known in Europe of the American continent up to the time they were so effectually cut off from the balance of the civilized world, and within the past 50 years, 2 other American ships had drifted to their shore. When I told him how many lives had been lost and how much treasure had been squandered by America and other nations in Arctic explorations, and expressed surprise that a people so advanced in the arts of civilization as his nation appeared to be should make no attempts to establish communication with other parts of the world, but should remain isolated for centuries, he smiled pleasantly and said he could appreciate my feelings. In the first place, he explained that the Iron Republic had never been engaged in maritime commerce to any considerable extent, even in the days when trading was encouraged, as there were no other great maritime nations to trade with. As a consequence, there was not that passion for voyaging and exploration which obtains among a maritime people. Nevertheless, some attempts had been made to get through the barriers, and as vessels had sailed away and never returned, it was supposed at the time that some of them might have succeeded in the attempt. Since the establishment of the Great Republic, though, no efforts had been made in that direction, for the reason that there was not sufficient private capital to undertake such enterprises, and from the knowledge they had of the outside world, the government did not desire closer intercourse with the older nations, as it could not possibly do them any good, and might result in much harm. This he admitted was a species of national selfishness, but selfishness, said he, with a smile, is human, and is one thing we have in common with all peoples past and present. He then told me that Captain Morris had reached their country with a ship and crew during the progress of the Great Civil War, and that some years before an old American whaler had come to their shores. The whaler remained with them a year, and then left with the intention of making his way back to America, and was never heard of again. Captain Morris, he informed me, was then in the country, and being a man of great ability, was at the head of the government Naval College. The most of his crew, too, were still living and were established in different parts of the country. At the conclusion of an hour of pleasant conversation, the affable director touched a button, saying that it was very probable that the press had given out the details of my arrival. Speaking into a bell-shaped transmitter directly over his table, he called "Current News," and then pushed back his chair in a listening attitude. In a moment, a voice, rich, strong, and distinct, answered back through the transmitter, "Current News, 8 o'clock to 10. President Wilkes and party arrived this morning at 8:20 by the through express, making the 760 miles from the capital to Corinthus in 4 hours and 10 minutes. The President comes down to participate in the formal opening of the new temple this evening. Everything is in perfect readiness, and when the lights are turned on tonight,
the people will have no cause to regret the money expended on its construction. It'll seat 5,000 people, and the architects, Messrs. Horn and Jameson, claim it the most perfect acoustic qualities of any auditorium in the Republic except possibly the amphitheater of the Capitol. In tests made yesterday, a whisper on the platform could be heard with perfect distinctness in the third gallery. The Grand Harmonium has been furnished with another chime of bells, the first set having been rejected by Professor Hallam on account of defectiveness of tone. The Winter King, Churchill's last masterpiece, will be rendered for the first time tonight. Professor Hallam has pronounced it one of the greatest triumphs of musical art. As the demand for seats will be large, admission will be had by drawings, commencing promptly at 12:30, no change of program as given. Senator Cromwell of the province of Urbana had an attack of paralysis this morning at 6 o'clock, as he was plowing in his field and has not yet recovered consciousness. This is his second attack, and the physicians fear it may prove fatal. Senator Cromwell is in the fourth year of his office as representative of the great province of Urbana, and by his modest dignity and usefulness has made himself one of the most popular senators that ever filled the office. He was the inventor of the Cromwell Barrow and was the first to adopt the practice of dehorning cattle. Exchange reports show that 27 million dimes were canceled yesterday. This large volume of business was caused by the approaching cooler weather, which called out a heavy tonnage of coal. Potatoes in bond are not doing well, and the Bureau of Subsistence has ordered them cut 20% to encourage consumption and prevent loss. The sensation of the day is the arrival of the Port Corinthus of another vessel from America. It was brought up this morning about 8 o'clock and is a typical American ship of 250 tons. Captain Brent, master, with a crew of 8. The vessel is owned by J. Edward Barrington of the United States and sailed through the barriers about 7 months ago. Mr. Barrington is at present in conference with the Director of Navigation, and it is not known what his plans for the future are. A great crowd is already collected on the pier of Professor Morris, the well-known American author and president of Naval College, will arrive from the capital on the 12 o'clock express to meet his countrymen. Special resume at 12 o'clock.
The voice ceased, and touching the button again, the director turned to me. I've not given all or anything like half of what came to us as current news, but just a simple sample. I inquired if this news was being read from a daily paper through a telephone, and the director replied that it was the paper, or what corresponded to it, itself. Do you mean to say, I asked with astonishment, that all of the people get the news as we have just heard it? I mean to say, answered the director, that several millions of people heard or had the opportunity of hearing the same voice giving out the same news that we have just listened to. And there is no paper printed? I asked, scarcely able to grasp the idea of such news service. None except what is printed right there, pointing to a small machine I had noticed ticking in the table. Every word you have heard is reproduced there in print and can be preserved for future reading or destroyed at the option of the patron. I stepped to the table and looked, but could make nothing out of the cabalistic signs on the paper before me. How is it, I inquired, that you speak the English language and do not use the Roman characters as other English-speaking people do? We used the same letters, answered the director, until the discovery of sound characters. Most of our books are printed in the old way, only the newest literature being printed with sound characters. What do you call a sound character? I asked. I may not be able to make you understand, said the director. If you are unfamiliar with the development and progress of the knowledge of sound, I told him the nature of sound as atmospheric vibrations was well understood by us, and mentioned the telephone and phonograph in common use as an illustration. Very well then, said he. It is simple enough. The vibrations are communicated to the machine, and the machine transmutes them into characters. Reproduce a sound 1,000,000 times and it will make the same character every time. It is a true phonetic system and is nature's own writing. And actually, there is some validity to this, which has just been recently discovered. This is sort of a reader's note in terms of, I believe it's some of the ancient Hebrew letters. When you apply them to you speak out the frequencies into a certain type of device that images those frequencies. The Hebrew letters actually, the spoken letters frequency signature looks like the letter itself. So, sort of interesting that that's only very recently been discovered, and this was written, well, in the early 1900s, like 1902, I think. So, pretty strange. So anyway, he says that it's nature's own writing. Amazed at a civilization evidently so far in advance of ours, I had forgotten the circumstances by which I was surrounded, and would have questioned further, but the genial official excused himself, saying that his duties would deprive him of the further pleasure of my company at that time, but that he hoped to meet me again soon outside of business hours, and in a social way. In the meantime, I would receive the attention of the government. Pressing another button, he informed me that a carriage was ready to return me to my vessel, where in a few hours I would probably be called upon by my distinguished countrymen and other representatives of the government. Grasping his extended hand heartily, I thanked him for his kindness and returned to the wharf. As I approached, in the conduct of the same officer who had carried me from the boat, the curious crowd fell back respectfully, and I passed on board. Notwithstanding our position was one calculated to repress every emotion except astonishment, I found Captain Brent in a tremendous state of wrath, and the steward was describing the heathenish country to which we had drifted, in a flight of profanity that was positively eloquent. On learning the cause, I found that the last-named dignitary had been out in the city trying to purchase fresh meats and vegetables, of which the men stood in great need after their long voyage. It seemed, though, that neither gold nor silver would be accepted in payment, and so the dinner of fresh victuals that all had looked forward to so eagerly was not in sight. We were soon relieved, however, by the appearance of a van load of fresh supplies, which the vendor said was brought on order from the Marine Office. I retired to my cabin and tried to collect my thoughts. I had been but a few hours in this wonderful country, and already my senses had taken in more, it seemed to me, than my mind could analyze and digest in weeks. I felt as if I would like to get away from myself, or away by myself for 2 or 3 days, and just think it over. Everything was so new and so strange that all mental effort was directed to grasping the situation. To be continued. Okay, The Iron Public continued by J.E. Barrington and Captain Brent by Richard Jameson Morgan. All rights reserved. This is Chapter 3 continued. After a dinner of fresh meats and vegetables, the first we had tasted since we left America, I was called on by Professor Morris, a fine-looking gentleman,